time for Global Insight, where we have experts discuss global issues in the spotlight right now. I'm Kim Do-yeon, filling in for Oh Soo-young. The meeting last week of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, in Uzbekistan brought Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping together with the leaders of SCO members such as India, Pakistan, and 4 Central Asian nations, as well as the presidents of Iran and Turkey. What caught the world's attention was the sideline summit between Russia and China, where they promised to help each other ward off Western influence in Asia. So what does this mean for the rest of the world? Today we talked to Professor Kim Jae-chun, Dean of Sogang Graduate School of International Studies, and Mason RICHEY, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Welcome to the show to both of you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Professor Kim, I want to start off, how influential is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and how significant is the timing of the meeting?
Well, the organization, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, started as a quite informal gathering between 5 countries: China, Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. And these countries were known as Shanghai 5. And this gathering was mainly to deal with borderline security between China and its post-Soviet neighbors. I think that was back in 1990s. In 2001, however, the founding members took the decision to transform the group into a more formal organization with a focus on fighting terrorism and religious extremism. Since then, some other countries joined the organization: Uzbekistan, India, Pakistan, and later Iran. Along the way, the organization became a quite formal security dialogue between these member countries. Major theme of the dialogue used to be terrorism and religious extremism, as I said, but more recently, Russia and China have sort of attempted to frame the organization as a kind of anti-NATO, anti-Western bloc. This attempt, I think, has something to do with the bifurcation of the international order that has been intensifying in recent years between the status quo-oriented liberal countries and revisionist autocracies. But that said, Russia and China don't really see eye to eye on war in Ukraine. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, they expressed that they don't really feel comfortable with the organization turning into an anti-Western bloc. And they also said that they had qualms about the war in Ukraine. So we'll have to see. We'll have to wait and see whether the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will present a unified front against the West. But as for now, it doesn't really look that way.
Right. And now, building off the context, Professor RICHEY, what does no limits partnership between Xi and Putin forged last February signify? This was before the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, so for quite some time, thought that Russia and China, in particular, along with some other allied states, or at least quasi-partner countries such as North Korea, potentially Iran, and some other countries, would form a sort of bloc to push back against the West, as we just heard the professor say. And the no limits partnership that was referred to, was sort of the cornerstone of that, or the foundation of that. But I think that what we're beginning to see is that no limits partnership is in fact a limited partnership. This is not to deny the strategic nature of that partnership. It's not just a marriage of convenience or a target of opportunity. I think Russia and China, or Xi and Putin, really are interested in the strategic partnership over the long term. But there are limits, and those limits are, in the first place, national interests, and in the second place, the personal interests of both Xi and Putin. And frankly speaking, it looks like the more that Russia looks like an unstable partner, or one who isn't as competent as before, that's going to make it easier for Xi to say that there are, in fact, some limits to that partnership. Because at the end of the day, Xi, like all good leaders, or like all leaders in general, is going to put his own interests first, and he isn't going to carry out that type of partnership inevitably and forever.
Right, and Professor RICHEY, I just want to build on more of that. Then the national interest for Xi is extremely important at this point, isn't it?
Yes, of course. She is obviously interested in pushing forward towards unification with Taiwan. There are problems, with COVID in the country, uneven economic development, demographic problems. China has a lot of national interest areas that need to be worked on, of course. And we shouldn't forget that all of those, in some ways, overlap with his own personal interest in staying in power, which we're going to see later this year. The attempt to staying in power for a third mandate at the upcoming party Congress. So again, anything that distracts from that and makes that more difficult is going to make it easier for Xi to decide that there do need to be some limits in between the interest and the partnership between China and Russia.
Right now, Professor Kim, talking about interests, are there some closely aligned interests between Russia and China that exist to keep them together?
I would probably say that their interests are very closely aligned in terms of confronting the United States and also in terms of trying to change the existing international order to their liking. Early this year, when Xi and Putin met before the Beijing Winter Olympic, the joint statement came out after the summit. I found that statement very interesting in the sense that it clearly stated that the U.S. is trying to engineer some kind of a democratic revolution both in China and Russia, and it is in the interest of both countries to stop this from happening. And second, the U.S. is in serious decline, and there is no going back. So both countries will have to take advantage of the current situation and to change the existing order. In that respect, two leaders announced a friendship without limits, and there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. But that said, their relationship does seem to have some limits, as Professor Rich just mentioned, because their interests are divergent on the Ukrainian war. And I think their relationship is actually a marriage of convenience. There is a strategic distrust between the two countries going all the way back to the early Cold War era. They had some serious borderline disputes, and they were vying for the leadership position in communist bloc. And now two countries don't really see eye to eye on the war in Ukraine.
Right. Building off of the war in Ukraine, Professor Richey, China has blamed the U.S. for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Is it in China's interest to see the war continue, at least?
There's one school of thought among international. In some sense, argues that China is in a no-lose situation here. If Russia succeeds in its strategic objectives, then China emerges from this war with a stronger and more capable partner. And then if, on the other hand, Russia strategically fails or is bled dry by this war, China is more likely to have Moscow or Russia as a sort of vassal state. I think that's too smart by half, and I think that the admission by Putin coming out of the most recent summit meeting, where he quotes Xi as having some concerns about the Ukraine war, is an admission of that. In fact, I think China is not looking at this Ukraine situation as a no-lose one, because I think it generates international uncertainty in a way that makes it harder for China to accomplish some of its objectives on the international stage. It certainly throws some uncertainty onto the process of how China would go about trying to unify with Taiwan, which is in some sense its number one overall international affairs objective. And we shouldn't forget that the war in Ukraine has brought NATO closer together. It's brought liberal states closer together in solidarity with each other. And NATO has increasingly looked, in fact, towards not only the European theater, but also towards the Indo-Pacific, as a place where NATO needs to be involved. And that's certainly not something that Xi finds very attractive. So I think, he probably at this point thinks that the Ukraine war is a mistake, and all things being equal, probably wishes that this would wind down in some way where China can move on and not have to have this be a distraction anymore.
Now, Professor Kim, it seems like from your reaction, you largely agree with everything Professor RICHEY is saying, but
I do.
many Central Asian countries are troubled by Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But what will China's position be now? Like Professor RICHEY has mentioned, it might not be going in a favorable situation. So will they be able to downright kind of object the ongoing war?
Well, you also have to look at the Central Asian countries. They are not just comfortable with Russia's vision of war in Ukraine. Uzbekistan made it very clear that they did not want the summit to sort of transform into an anti-Western gathering. And Kazakhstanis also repeatedly expressed their refusal to support Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. Russia wanted to reinforce the organization's military dimension and then proposed a joint military drill on Russian soil next year. But Central Asian countries just didn't like that idea. They want to steer away from global geopolitical issues. They want to focus more on regional projects. There, Russia plays a very minimal role. As for China, from the very onset of the war, Ukrainian war, they didn't really throw full weight behind Russians, although China sympathized Russian security concerns as NATO tried to expand eastward to Ukraine. But China never really endorsed the war. A couple of reasons, I think. First and foremost, as Professor Rich mentioned, China's foreign policy mantra has been sovereignty, sovereignty, and sovereignty. So don't interfere with us on Taiwan or Hong Kong issues because they belong to sovereign rights of China, Xinjiang and Uyghur issue, and also Tibet issues as well. So, I mean, think about the Ukrainian war. The Ukrainian war was a blatant violation of Ukrainian sovereign rights and territorial integrity of Ukraine. So supporting the war sort of contradicts the most important foreign policy principle of China. China is a power on the rise, but Russia is a power in serious decline. So China, I guess, wants to behave as more of a stakeholder country than does Russia.
Right, and now, Professor RICHEY, we know that it does go against the idea of China's sovereignty, but to what extent will China support or even help Russia in its invasion of Ukraine?
I wish I could say something to disagree with the professor because I think it would make more entertaining television. But I largely agree with Professor Kim's previous remarks. And going forward, I'm not sure what could cause China to change its position. We've seen China be very limited in its military equipment support for Russia in the Ukraine invasion. The United States, Treasury Department and the White House has already said that China has largely avoided violating sanctions that the United States has put on Russia. That is to say, the secondary sanctions, which would cause the United States to trigger sanctions also against China. The China-Russia relationship economically has still grown despite the sanctions. I think it's at its largest point ever. So trade has actually increased, but it has violated sanctions apparently, or at least not sufficiently for the U.S. to be upset about it. China has offered diplomatic and rhetorical support, and that's useful for Russia certainly, but it's clearly not decisive. And I honestly don't see what could cause that to change. If Russia starts to improve its performance against Ukraine noticeably, arguably China wouldn't need to do anything else. And if, on the other hand, things continue to worsen on the ground tactically and strategically for Russia, I don't see why China would back a losing horse. So as I said, I think China at the end of the day is just interested in this war winding down in a way that is good for China. And the sooner, probably the better.
Right. And Professor Kim, lastly, so now, in that sense, do you think Biden and Xi will be able to make any progress on improving ties when they meet in November at the G20 summit?
This year, G20 summit will take place in Indonesia, and Indonesia confirmed that both Xi and then Putin would participate in the summit, but the U.S. and other Western countries, other Western G20 countries, expressed their opposition to Putin's coming to G20. So we have yet to see whether Putin would actually come to the venue or participate in the meeting virtually. If he comes, there is a possibility for President Biden to boycott G20 this year. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see whether President Biden and President Xi would be able to meet in November at the G20 venue. If they both come to the summit, I expect the two leaders, Biden and Xi, to meet bilaterally, though the meeting would be very brief. I don't think they would make any progress or have a constructive talks on improving the relations, because both countries are in strategic competition for a long haul. I don't think they could sort out differences in many substantial issues such as Taiwan, South China Sea, Uyghur, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and many other important issues. But having said that, I think the meeting in and of itself is important, because the summit between the two countries can sort of operate as a guardrail, particularly when there haven't been any serious and meaningful strategic dialogues between the two countries. So the summit can work as an important mechanism through which both countries can prevent conflicts from escalating into full-blown military confrontation.
Right, and as you mentioned, Biden has to be there first, so we'll have to watch to make sure that all the leaders will be at the G20 summit. Now, unfortunately, that's where we must leave it for today due to time. That was Professor Kim Jae-chun, the Dean of Sogang Graduate School of International Studies, and Mason RICHEY, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you both for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.